We are showing ourselves, and our audience is showing us, that it's not about perfection, that they support us in the first place. Hey y'all, it's Chimdi. So I started my Patreon in July of 2020. I looked back at my earnings to see, and they actually had all those zeros from the months where I started my account, but I didn't think I'd be able to make any money with it, so I never made it public. So I spent a year and a half on Patreon telling nobody about it because I thought nobody would give me any money. And honestly, that is the number one lesson, that if you're watching this and you either have a Patreon, then most likely you haven't started one yet. That's the most important thing to know, is the biggest hurdle, the biggest barrier is getting over the idea that what you're creating is worth it, that people want to support you, that you deserve to have support, which is really about like love and like you loving yourself and your healing journey. It's a whole thing. The moment you can accept the fact that people love you and they care about you and they want to support you, that is when you'll be able to actually launch your Patreon and create benefits and create tiers that feel good and feel authentic and honor what you create and honor the audience that you're building. Take this nugget if you take nothing else. But let's also get into some specifics. When you're creating your tiers, I would not advise you go lower than $3 for your lowest tier. And I would advise you to have at least one tier that scares you just a little bit. Like it scares you just how much money you're asking from people. For me, when I started, that was a tier that was $49. I genuinely did not think anyone would sign up. And the benefits that I had on that tier were pretty intense, like regular one-on-one calls, editing with me sessions, sharing my scripts, sharing my notes, sharing resources. Like I was pouring a lot into that tier because part of me didn't believe anyone would buy it, but I was like, if they do, I want to make sure it is worth it for them. And that brings me to a very important point, which is the reason why people support you on Patreon. So I was gonna just come up and reflect and tap into my intuitive knowing about why I'm being supported on Patreon, and I thought, actually, let me just ask some of my patrons.
Hey everyone, I'm coming to y'all from the editing bay to tell you that I became a patron of Chimdi's for a few reasons.
She makes content that I truly enjoy.
I found her when I was watching the Quit Job video, right?
I support Chimdi's work because her channel has been a really important resource for me as I left my 9-to-5 to be a writer and a change doula.
In most of the videos, I can resonate with her.
I understand how important money is as a motivating factor as a creative.
Wow, her whole catalog is just kind of her being herself, vulnerable, and just really showing why and how she's doing things, and her lessons, her stories, you know, her teachings from them.
Chimdi brings grace and wisdom and humor and really makes me feel less alone on this path.
And the other thing is, I wanted to be more inspired than I already am on a daily basis, and watching Chimdi just gives me that bit of energy that I need to get through like a tough editing session like I'm editing right now.
So I decided to just support her so she could continue to do what she does best. I love you, Chimdi. Continue being great.
The overarching theme is that it's not actually about the benefits I offer. I went on YouTube when I was ready to actually make my Patreon public, and I was like, okay, what are some Patreon ideas? And I picked the ones that felt like they wouldn't be too high of a lift for me because I knew I didn't want to burn myself out creating on Patreon, and ultimately it didn't really matter. Like one of the things I did was I created a video cast, like a separate video podcast just for my patrons. It was something I did on my YouTube channel. It was super low lift, and I was like, okay, great, that'll be easy to do. And still, nobody watched it because they didn't really care. It wasn't really about the benefits. It was really about supporting me. For me, I found that within the first month of launching my $49 tier, I had 2 people sign up, which genuinely shocked me. genuinely shocked me. And so just give yourself the chance to receive. I think of it as like opening portals. You know, like there's all this money out here in the world. Do you have a portal that's big enough to accept all of this money and all of this overflow? And how big is your portal, right? Like, do you stop at $3? Do you stop at $5? Do you stop at $20? I do these coaching consult calls for folks who are interested in creative coaching, and someone reached out to me about money and abundance and was talking to me about how he was approaching Patreon, and I gave him that advice around just have one tier. Like, it's really just about how much are you willing, how much is comfortable for you to accept. And then because coaching is often for the coachee but also the coach, I then took my own advice and I added a new tier called Benefactor onto mine that's now $150, because I'm like, yeah, I actually am fully ready to receive $150 if there's someone in my audience who wants to bless me in that way. And I think that's the main thing, is like, you don't want to cap your blessings before people have the chance to bless you. Like, let people bless you. One thing that's really important as well is that people are going to drop off. and it is not personal. It could be personal, but it probably isn't personal. Like everything in life, Patreon gives you a chance to really hold a mirror up to the stuff that's going on inside of you. Because if you have someone who leaves your Patreon, if you take it personally, that says something about the way you engage with people supporting you in your regular life. You never know what's going on. I've had folks go all up and down the spectrum. Sometimes I have a sense of what's going on in their personal life, so I know like, oh, this person, they just lost their job. I'm not surprised they're no longer supporting me on Patreon. For this person, they just got a job, so I see why they bumped up the money. And it was nothing to do with any change I had made over the course from 1 month to the next. It was a reflection of their circumstances. So being able to hold lightly the fact that people support you when they can, and it has nothing to do with you necessarily if they withdraw their support. I think it's also important to remember that the Patreon tiers and the Patreon benefits are not permanent. So you can give yourself room to explore and see what works. I started with a whole different set of benefits. Not a whole different set, but there were a lot of things that I offered in the beginning that I don't offer now, in part because it wasn't sustainable for me to do. So for instance, I usually edit my videos right before they go live. So it's not really feasible for me to like share a version of the video before it goes live on YouTube. So that was something I offered at first, and now I don't offer it. I used to offer Patreon only live streams. Usually I was saying that people normally are supporting you, not specifically the benefit, but that was a benefit that I found was a direct converter from my YouTube audience into my Patreon. I would go live on YouTube, would have a really fun time, it'd be really exciting and great and a lot of joy and energy and laughs and all this good stuff. And I'd be like, okay, we're gonna keep the party going over at Patreon. If you wanna join me, that's where it is. And so people would come, they would like sign up for my Patreon and join just to hang out with me on the lives. I did that for like a couple of months, you know, but I was like, actually, it's not so fun to have a one-way conversation, especially knowing this also came from my creative coaching consults. A lot of creative people, sometimes they're in spaces where they don't have other creatives to bounce ideas off of, to talk, to connect. And if you're new in your creative journey, you don't have anyone who's doing it like you, it can feel so isolating. And so people had been asking me, like, one of the things I want to do is build a creative community. And I was like, oh, well, I'm a facilitator, you know? And so what I did with my most recent live is instead of just having us do another one on the Patreon, I actually created a Zoom call. And so someone who had literally found me only 5 minutes ago, I think they found me the day before, subscribed. The next day I went live. 5 minutes before I went live, they saw the notification, they joined me, and then that day became a patron. So it can happen very quickly, especially if you're doing what feels good anyway, you're doing what people already want, and that way you're not burning yourself out. Like I remember sitting there in the Zoom being like, this is so much easier and so much more chill than it is for me to be like coming up with things to say for an hour straight as a way to engage my audience. You want to do things that already feel natural. You don't want to be pulling teeth and going above and beyond for your Patreon because it just won't be sustainable. And I just want to share this because a friend mentioned that they hadn't thought of doing it like this. You can also use Patreon as a payment exchange, essentially. Part of the reason why I didn't give y'all my numbers. So when I actually did launch my Patreon in January of this year, up to this point, I've gotten $1,409. I've had 23 patrons over the course of these 6 or so months. And right now I have 13 and I'm making around $124 a month. Part of the reason why I have a pretty big sum despite the number of patrons is because I used it for coaching for a little bit. So I actually would bring people through my coaching services by having them sign up for my Patreon. So at that time I didn't really know how to set up Calendly and Stripe and all those things, and it just seemed like an easier way to like, yeah, you could just sign up for this thing, I'll get the money and I don't have to worry about the billing, right? So if there are things that you want to sell and you don't necessarily want to set up a store, that could be one of the ways to sort of get comfortable with receiving money and exchanging it for services. Eventually though, I had to get off of there because the fee was 8%. So they were taking a nice chunk of my money and I was like, Patreon, you're not helping me coach, okay? You don't need to take that much of my money. So I did eventually sign up for Calendly, and now folks, when they sign up for coaching, they can just pay via those calls and it's so much easier. But if that's something that you hadn't considered, maybe consider doing that with Patreon. And then finally, one of the things that I think is great to share is behind the scenes stuff. So I'll sometimes share like the script and notes, for instance, from this, I'm sharing it with my Patreon people. One thing that's important to remember is that the behind the scenes stuff doesn't need to be perfect. When I first started sharing my scripts and my notes, I made like perfectly beautiful notes and I had all these nice rows and arrows and columns and things like that. And I was like, that's not the truth. Like, that's not honest. And part of the reason why people want to see the behind the scenes of you as a creator is because they want to see that it's realistic for them to do it too. And I think that includes showing them that it's not always perfectly polished all the time. For instance, this is my second time recording this video because the first version of it was blurry as hell. So I'll go ahead now, upload the first version of this video to my Patreon so they can see also how things change from recording something one time to the second time. But it's not always perfect. We're creators creators, we're learning as we go, and we're just letting the light, you know, flow through us. Sometimes it looks incredible, sometimes Either way, it's part of the process, and I think all of that really allows us as creators and our audience to really form a genuine connection, because we're not trying to pretend that we are perfect, and we are showing ourselves, and our audience is showing us that it's not about perfection, that they support us in the first place. They support us because they love us and they care about us and they want us to succeed, and if they can be a part of it, they are happy to be a part of it. I actually moved to a pay what you want model, so instead of even having benefits and tiers that are broken up by each one, I'm just saying, hey, I recognize that you have your own journey. You may have a lot of resources that you want to share with me. Awesome. Either way, I'm giving you what I have because I know that ultimately I'm going to be rewarded. I will see you on the next video. Thank you for watching. Bye.